Buongiorno a tutti e benvenuti a questa seconda sessione del convegno corelliano. Io prima di cominciare vorrei ringraziare Enrico Gatti per avermi invitato a presiedere questa sessione e anche fare un ringraziamento al Comitato Scientifico per tutto questo lavoro che è stato fatto attorno a Corelli. Oggi sarà una sessione con 4 interventi, tutti in lingua inglese. I'm very pleased to introduce you the first speaker of this session, Gregory Barnett. Gregory Barnett is Associate Professor of Musicology at the Shepherd School of Music, Rice University. He is the author of a book on Baroque-era Italian instrumental music, on Bolognese instrumental music, and has also published articles on the history of music theory, historical string instruments, and Georg Friedrich Händel. He was co-editor of the recent, the last proceeding of Corellian studies held here in 2003, and contributed articles to that collection and other collection of Studi Corelliani. His research has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, the Bellagio Center of the Rockefeller Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Fulbright Program, and American Musicological Society. The title of his paper today is Tempo, Meter, and Rhythmic Notation in Late Seicento Sonatas. Please.
Buongiorno. Prima di tutto chiedo scusa per il mio inglese americanizzato. The only known music by the Bolognese composer Francesco Pratichista is a collection of dances entitled Concerti armonici di correnti e balletti of 1666. It is distinguished in the vast instrumental repertory of late Seicento Italy for the detailed performing instructions given to each dance, most of which concern tempo. Of particular interest here is his corrente, la fava, which is notated in several consecutive meters, 3-4, 3-2, 3-1, and 6-4, and with the following instruction. Si avverte che le mutanze delle tripole non mutano il tempo e non si fa molto in fretta. As far as I know, Pratichista's playful corrente is unique in this, but it nonetheless raises the broader question of just how the notation of meter, tempo, and rhythm worked in the music of the late Seicento. On the one hand, Pratichista's corrente relies on a steady pulse throughout the dance, in which the note value associated with that pulse is regularly changing. On the other hand, further examples support the practice of meter relationships regulated by numerical proportions, such as Giovanni Buonaventura Viviani's very specific indication to play 24 16th notes in the place of 16 for one measure before the sign for common time, tempo ordinario, restores the prior meter. In his Opus 5 violin sonatas, Corelli handles a comparable change with a proportional meter and then its inversion. The effect in both cases is hardly exotic, sextuplets in Viviani and triplets in Corelli, but the simultaneity of both pulse equivalent and proportional meters reflects a pluralism in notational practice that is underscored in a balletto from Giovanni Battista Vitali's Artifici Musicali of 1689. The two violins, using common time and 12/8 simultaneously, demonstrate how the 12 chrome in 12/8 take the same amount of time as 8 chrome in common time. The third part here, the violone in 3/4 meter, is fitted to the others by relying on a similar kind of pulse equivalence to that of Pratichista's corrente. In this case, the semi-minim proceeds at the same tempo, whether under 3/4 or common time, so that the violin and violone parts have the same number of semi-minims across a different number of measures. Vitali thus demonstrates both proportional and pulse-equivalent relationships between the three parts of his balletto. The former affirms the traditional meaning of numerical time signatures, and the latter contradicts it. Pratichista and Vitali can be seen at play with the options inherent in the notation of Corelli's era, in which, as we shall see, newly proliferating numerical signatures and tempo words coexist with traditional mensural signs and persisting coloration. Redundancies and contradictions abound in the interface between these older and newer notational habits, and composers can be seen to identify themselves as traditionalists or progressives depending on their notational choices. Above all, mutable rhythms permeate the notational practice of late Seicento sonata composers, with the result that even Corelli can seem strange. I begin my survey with the old. In addition to the frequently used signs for what was called tempo imperfetto minore, that is, tempo ordinario, or common time, as I'll call it, and tempo imperfetto maggiore, that is, tempo alla breve, or cut time, the difference between these two, or in contrast to these two, other mensuration signs were used in the sonatas through the 1680s and 90s. These signified perfect time with a full circle, major prolation with the dot, and both perfect time and major prolation with the full circle and dot. Note, however, from the last of these pieces, that by Cazzati, that the mensuration signs alone do not guarantee perfections. Rather, composers assumed imperfect breves and semibreves and signaled perfection with a dot added to the note, whatever the mensuration sign might be. Writing in 1701, Girolamo Ruffa bemoaned this practice and argued for the exclusive use of the semicircle with and without numerical proportions in order to signify imperfect time and minor prolation in all music. I'm quoting here, I segni di perfezione degli antichi già si sono disusati e noi a che fine, senza necessità, vogliamo mischiare il moderno con l'antico, e se vogliamo usare il circolo intero, oppure inciso, dobbiamo anche osservare d'alterare le semibrevi e di soggiacere alle regole di perfezionare ed imperfezionare le brevi e di sottomerci di nuovo a tutte le leggi antiche, le quali sono state reprobate e rifiutate come inutili da uomini che hanno avuto sale in testa. Ruffa had good reason to inveigh against the survival of older practices, because in the form of black against white or white against black coloration, they were redundant at best and confusing at worst. Coloration, as Giovanni Maria Bononcini explains, both causes imperfection and prohibits alteration. It was therefore used in passages within triple meter where a reader might otherwise assume either perfection or alteration. For example, in the movement in a Sinfonia by Uccellini from 1667, notated in imperfect time and major prolation, illustrates, first, the common use of coloration to signal hemiola, and second, at the end of the excerpt, coloration extended to the minim. The reason for the black inversions in hemiola is simply to create a sesquialtera proportion, 3 semibreves in the place of 2, without resorting to a numerical signature at that point. In the mensuration that Uccellini uses, breves are imperfect, that is worth 2 semibreves, and semibreves perfect, that is worth 3 minims. The coloration, however, signals imperfect semibreves, semibreves that equal 2 minims. But because alteration and perfection were never actually practiced in instrumental music, coloration functioned more as a fail-safe. Further uses occur even within imperfect time and minor prolation, where, given the mensural signs, no extra indication of imperfection is needed. And If blackened forms of normally white notes functioned as a fail-safe against misreadings of the rhythm, they actually created an ambiguity in the case of blackened minims, because these were indistinguishable from regular semiminims. A few passages, the last of which simply uses wrong durations, these few passages illustrate the potential for confusion, and such cases were a likely impetus for a further refinement of coloration that lasted into the 18th century: white chrome and semichrome. The whitened chrome were equivalent to regular black semiminims in duration, and whitened semichrome to regular black chrome. As an illustration, Gimignano Sangiovanni's Primi Ammaestramenti della Musica Figurata of 1714. Wait a minute. There it is. Sangiovanni shows two equivalent passages in 3/2, the one above using regular semiminims and the one below using white chrome. By replacing semiminims with white chrome as the next smaller duration after the minim, there could be no confusion between black minims and regular semiminims, because the next smaller duration after the minim is now the white chroma. That, in theory, is the advantage of white chrome and semichrome, but in practice, composers used white chrome unsystematically and unadvantageously. In most cases in which they occur, there are no blackened minims that would require an alternative. Uccellini and Cazzati's uses are exceptions within the instrumental repertory, exceptions in that they show a competent use of the notation. Instead, composers alternated freely between regular semiminims and white chrome from piece to piece, or sometimes within a piece. The semicircolo traversato, that is, the slash semicircle or cut time, is one notational archaism whose meaning was preserved, at least among some musicians of Corelli's time. The slash, as Bononcini explains in his 1673 treatise, Musico Pratico, will cause durations to lose half their value. And I won't quote him. Writing in 1697, Lorenzo Gregori confirms Bononcini's rule, but with the added possibility that the beating of time itself, rather than the notes, could move twice as fast. The practice of a fast battuta in cut time and a slow one in common time is described by Adriano Banchieri earlier in the century, where he notes, with disapproval, the habit of conducting cut time pieces in white note durations quickly and common time pieces in black note durations more slowly, so that they end up sounding the same. Note that Banchieri describes the different tempos not proportionally, but with tempo words, presto and adagio. Thus, Maurizio Cazzati would designate a balletto of his opus 15, dances, this is 1667, he designates this balletto as alla breve, ovvero come sta ma presto, to mean that the performer may either take a battuta at the breve or choose to take a quicker battuta at the usual semi-breve level, as notated. The result should nonetheless be the same. For Corelli's part, his use is complicated by the addition of tempo words, allegro or presto, which I take to be cautionary or redundant because he uses cut time predominantly for the lively gavotte or gavotte-like movements, and because there is evidence that he took cut time as double the speed of common time. Compare a gavotte in typical cut time with two other versions, in both cases either common time or 2/4 time. The original durations are replaced by those twice as fast. Apart from its meaning of doubled tempo, cut time was, for Corelli and others, a marker of learned style, antique, or the sacred. Writing in 1706, but repeating opinion already a century old, Zaccaria Tevo associates tempo alla breve with 16th century sacred polyphony, recalling the legend of Palestrina's preservation of polyphony within the liturgy. Within instrumental genres also, cut time was associated with ecclesiastical music in a specific type of movement, sometimes designated a cappella or alla breve. And more, the number of canons written by composers in cut time illustrates this latter point. I'm not showing you that, but you can take my word that canons proliferate among sonata composers marked in cut time. So that the sign for cut time meter, more than just another meter, is a symbol to mark the self-consciously learned as much as the sacred or the antique. For Corelli, however, this style is new to him, appearing only in his Opus 6 Concerti, and it represents his one concession to erudition and archaism. Otherwise, Corelli didn't write canons, avoided abstruse mensurations, and never dabbled in coloration. Unlike Bononcini or Vitali, and even Cazzati, Corelli showed little interest in the recherche. Both the implied precision of cut time and its long history are contrasted markedly by the proliferating tempo words of the late 17th century. The late Renaissance ensemble canzona was free of them, yet by the time of Corelli, the already established tempo words of largo, grave, adagio, allegro, vivace, and presto were already expanded by the terms lento, adagissimo, adagio, adagio, presto, presto, prestissimo, vivace, ma non presto, vivace e presto, vivace al possibile. Banchieri's testimony early in the 17th century concerning fast tempos in cut time and slow tempos in common time already suggests a variable speed of the battuta, and composers made the expanding range of battuta speeds explicit with all of these tempo words. However, a few caveats apply. First, tempo words were used in both cautionary and literal ways. Oh, there are my canons. As cautionary indications, the music of long durations might be designated adagio, and that of short durations presto, so that, respectively, slow and fast music might result even without a change of battuta. By contrast, a literal reading of tempo words interprets them as changing the speed of the underlying battuta, as necessitated in the music of Bononcini. So the above example is cautionary, I'm arguing, and the below example is literal application of tempo words. This same dualism in tempo word function both confirms and contradicts proportional meters. The confirming example is easier to comprehend because tempo words alternate allegro for the proportionally faster 12/8 and adagio for the slower 8/12. A contrasting example is Vinaccesi's second sonata of 1687, which shows common time 6/4, 4/6, and 6/4 meters in a prelude. Here, the added tempo words contradict a proportional reading. Without tempo words, the 6/4 section would be perceived as moving faster, 6 semiminims per battuta instead of 4. But Vinaccesi calls for a slower motion at that point. This would imply, if any precise relationship, pulse equivalence between the common time and 6/4 sections, in which the semiminimum remains constant and the battuta thus slows down from adagio in common time to più adagio in 6/4. A second complication of tempo designations is that any slow to fast arrangement of them would need qualifying because several of them appear in pairings that contradict a simple gradation from one to the other. Each of these emphasizes a third caution about tempo words and their meaning. They had always borne connotations beyond tempo itself, also communicating a predominant affect or a specific style of articulation. And the intensity of that affect, if anything, increases in the newer designations from the last decades of the century. Of those markings that had a clear bearing on articulation, of the bow in particular, numerous late 17th and early 18th century designations point to a vogue of crisply defined bowings within both slow and fast movements. The opposite, that is, indications of sustained bowings, is relatively uncommon. Thus, tempo words proliferate, but proportional relationships persist. Likewise, perfection, imperfection, and alteration disappear, but coloration, in particular white minims and semiminims, survives. But despite the mixture of distinct and incompatible notation systems, the music of the period is not hard to read, and the examples that I've presented in my survey are hardly ambiguous, at least once you get used to them. My final section turns to the evidence for rhythmic alteration in the dances of the instrumental music as a case and in a case study of the giga. And these do raise an ambiguity, and one that undermines our understanding of the dance's rhythmic profile. To begin, late Seicento composers notated the giga in no fewer than 9 different meters: 12/8, which is the most common, 12/16, 3/8, 6/8, 9/8, 3/1, 3/4, common time, and cut time. That notational flexibility extends even to the rhythm itself, the first symptom of which is the frequent use of different meters in different parts to notate that dance. Underdotting the dotted rhythms and applying note inégale to paired chrome in the duple meter parts will coordinate most of the simple duple and compound duple rhythms. In a performance of coordinated rhythms, the 2 semichrome upbeats of Pegalotti's giga would actually be shortened, thus a form of overdotting as well as the underdotting necessary. And measure 5, beat 2 of Bononcini's giga offers a so far uncategorized example of alteration. By means of these alterations in performance, the rhythms of simple and compound meters could be treated as sounding equivalents. And there's more to the rhythmic complexities of the giga because of numerous examples that occur wholly in duple meter, that is, without any part in compound meter. In some, composers use triplet chrome to capture the same rhythm as chrome in compound meter. But most of the common time gigas do not do this. This last example, and like others, and others like it, raises several questions. Why would composers forego compound meter altogether within a dance type that is defined by that meter's rhythms? And why would they notate within a single piece equal chrome that are to be made unequal and dotted chrome, semichrome that are to be underdotted, all to approximate the same lilting trochaic rhythm of the giga that is represented in 12/8 by the semiminimum chroma figure? Further examples of wholly duple meter gigas only raise further questions of rhythmic interpretation. How are the chroma plus 2 semichrome figures to be realized in Carlo Antonio Marino's Giga? And could he really have meant for paired chrome figures and the dotted chroma plus semichroma figures to be performed as the same rhythm? And how should 4 semichrome figures, which do occur later in this dance, you don't see them, but they're there, how do 4 semichrome figures, how are those to be performed? Pietro degli Antoni adds a rhythm of 2 semichrome plus a chroma. The same question applies as before. How was this rhythm performed in the context of a giga? The larger question raised by these interpretive puzzles is whether the duple meter gigas should be reconciled with compound meter gigas. Examples in mixed duple and compound meters would seem to argue for it, but only if we assume that compound meter was indeed the defining standard of the dance. In this instance, the giga of Corelli's Opus 2, number 9, confronts us with the problem of defining the giga itself. And now I'll play some music. Tecnici, I hear no sound from my computer. Yes. There we go. Now another recording. Corelli himself thus affords us a glimpse of the liminal giga, whose characteristic trochaic rhythm has both more and less lilt, shifting between rollicky, triply subdivided rhythms of the compound meter and more marked, incisive, quadruply divided rhythms of the subdivided duple meter. To conclude, the practice of mensuration, the fortunes of coloration, and now the possibilities of rhythmic alteration in the music of the late Seicento sonata composers all reveal something of each musician's temperament, conservative or progressive, practical or flamboyant, learned or experimental. Every composer will combine different measures of these qualities, and I argue here that we can read their temperaments according to their notational choices. As for Corelli, I have previously noted his playful interest in rhythm, and here we see him at play with the mutable rhythmic qualities inherent in the notation of his time. That element of caprice permeates the instrumental repertory. Remember that my paper began with a corrente by a minor composer at play. Corelli's Giga finishes it with an example by a much better composer. Thank you.
Thank you to Gregory Barnett for this very interesting paper, which shows the complexity of tempo meter and rhythm notation in the late Seicento sonatas. Questions, curiosities? Lower Lindgren?
Gregory Barnett, I thought during the first half of your presentation that virtually everything you were showing was either in a triple meter or a triple subdivision. And it strikes me that that is mainly the reason why these peculiarities in notation were needed. Duple meter doesn't require all those things. And when you started talking about cut time, and Corelli, you were using a lot of duple meter, but at the very end you came back to triple divisions of beats which were jigs. And I've always wondered why so many of the pieces in sonatas of the late Say and early Settecento are in cut time or common time. And do you think that quite a few of those were played in a triple division so that we could have something? But the basic question is this largely a triple meter phenomenon?
The only duple meter phenomenon is related to tempo, and specifically the relationship between common time and cut time, because there's a lot of argument that the proper relationship is not being maintained. And the interesting thing I found when I looked hard at Corelli is that it seems that Corelli may have intended a proper relationship between those two. That's really all that came up for me about duple. But with these gigas, I started looking at more music, and if I had more time, I'd produce further examples where, given the experience or given the example of the giga, you start to wonder about other compositions and how much rhythmic alteration there might actually have been in performances of Corelli's time. For instance, yesterday, Corelli's inability to understand the French style came up. But if you look at the prelude to his 9th concerto, his Opus 6, number 9, that thing looks to me pretty much in the stile francese. And that thing, in its notation, if you look at the individual parts and the misalignments of rhythms, that thing calls for rhythmic alteration. So back to triple. How much triple infected otherwise purely notated duple? I don't know. The giga, when it gets to looking duple, is very closely related to the gavotta. And gavottas often have triplet subdivisions in them. So what did these things sound like in actual performance? How much liberty did individual performers take? I don't know, but after looking at it, I think more than I used to think, and that's really all I wanted to accomplish here, is defamiliarize us with this notation a little bit.
Those are very good points. There are quite a few Handel instrumental pieces that began by notating dotted 8th, 16th, dotted 8th, 16th, perhaps for 2 measures.
Yeah.
And then everything else in the whole piece is just eighths. There are no dots. And
Yup.
a lot of people have insisted that those are meant to be triplets all the way through, because the French had their doubly dotted notes, but we should leave those doubly dotted notes in France and not export them to Italy or England.
Mm-hmm. Is that a question? Do you want me to stake a position on?
Of course.
On which? The Handel? Overdotting? No. I wouldn't leave overdotting to the French. It's in Italy, too. Basically, if you apply the same rule of synchronizing between the parts that you do to the French, that you do to Bach, you'll find the same cases in the same style of music by Italian composers. By Corelli, that Opus 6, number 9, is the same example. So either it was all fortuitous, he's writing in this style that happens to be French, which he otherwise doesn't know. No, I wouldn't accept that. I would say that the same principles of rhythmic alteration are known and practiced in Italy. And so I'm waiting for a big wave of resistance. I expect anyone who's performed this music has already arrived at these conclusions without knowing some of these more obscure examples that I've produced. But if there's an argument, I'm ready for it.
Mark van Schmelik.
Van Skeevik.
Thanks for a great paper. I had a question about the proportions and the tempo words in the,
Yeah.
let's say, the less, you know, the other composers' works. Not Corelli, I mean.
Like this one?
Yeah, for instance. You use the term tempo words. Do you think that there is a specific tempo associated with, or do you think, as I've thought for a long time, that still as in the earlier 17th century, there were some kind of words that define more of a character, an affect that alters the proportion just slightly without keeping a strict proportion. Do you see that differently in the later 17th century? What's your thoughts? What are your thoughts about that?
Some of both, and even more options. Look, studying this stuff has in its way been the graveyard of my theories about how this notation works. That is, every time I think I've come up with a principle, I find an example to contradict it. So, for instance, in the late 17th century, the meter 3/2, 9 times out of 10, 3/2 by itself is a slow triple meter, as confirmed by the tempo words that are typically associated with it. And I would say there, the tempo words serve a cautionary function. Now, that is a bit of a circular argument, I know. But then in that 10th case, I'll find a 3/2. There's one in Corelli. There's one 3/2 that's presto or allegro. Darn it. So, you know, I can't say for a certainty that 3/2 means slow triple and 3/8 means fast triple. There are German theorists in the 18th century who say just that. You know, the smaller the denominator, the smaller the note value that takes the beat, the faster the meter. So that 2/4 is faster than 4/4, for instance. Sorry, 2/8 would be faster than 2/4, but even 2/4 is faster than 4/4, and it's a newer meter. Alas, that works out a lot of the time, but not all of the time. Now, your question also was about the function of tempo words. And I've pretty much divided it into two functions, which are mostly distinct, but not entirely. The one being cautionary, as I said, and the other being literal. But mixed into this, I mentioned, was that tempo words always connote an affect. And the affect itself will have some bearing on, you know, how you interpret the meter without the tempo word. So my cautionary and literal are not absolutes. I would say there are more obviously cautionary uses and less obviously cautionary. In this case, this is more cautionary. But when you see the adagio means at your ease. Allegro means happy. You know, both connote, you know, a sense of being. And that should, for a sensitive musician, affect the way that they play. So cautionary, yes, but there's more to it. There's always more to it. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Just wanted to mention another example a bit outside of Corelli. It's the Trio Sonata by Fuchs in F major. Maybe you know it. It's for oboe and flauto dolce. And it's very interesting regarding this discussion because there's one movement, actually it's the flauto dolce, of course, is for the Italian style and the oboe for the French style in that sonata. And one movement is called Les Ennemis Confus. Mm-hmm. So the flauto dolce is completely in 12/8 meter and the oboe in C. So that means the question rises, it's the same. Well, should we coordinate or not, or should we just play with this contrast? And could that also be for Italian jigs? That's for jigs in Corelli style. That he played with this contrast of the taste of the French and the Italian taste.
You know, in the giga, I don't think French style enters into it, really. I think this is an indigenous Italian tradition of rhythmic alteration. I don't think, because these gigas don't resemble what I recognize as French-style gigas. Now, what Fuchs is doing when he says, you know, the confused enemies, he is also at play, and I reckon there were maybe more than a few musicians who would be confounded by these notational traditions, and that's the joke. Whereas, you know, those who understood would work it out. You know, where there's a question in my mind is what working it out ultimately adds up to. Because that second example that I played, it is the more literal reading of what Corelli wrote, but it's not precisely literal. Those who are reading in subdivided duple sound like they start to slip in a little bit of the lilt, which you can't help but do if you're listening to triply divided music going along and trying to subdivide, or at least, you know, unless you're making a virtuoso effort. So, you know, that kind of slippage makes me wonder, you know, what the latitude was in actual performance. But the awareness of this latitude is precisely, I think, what's on these composers' mind, particularly Fuchs's. You know, I would love it if Corelli used maybe some designations that would confirm what I think he was thinking, but he doesn't.
Any questions? I have one. I find very interesting your observation about the relationship between tempo notation and the meaning of tempo words used in this sonata. And I was thinking about the implications of this relationship on the formal structure of the sonata. Is there any relationship in that?
Relationship between what? The tempo words or the sequence of affects?
The sequence of affects.
Yeah. You know, there's a kind of generic progression. As you get toward the end of the century, that is, when you have clearly distinct movements, most of them marked with tempo words, there's a generic progression, and it's one that, you know, I don't know how successful it was, but I talk about it in some writing I've done about sonatas, especially the Sonata da Chiesa, given that specific example, the association of the movements of the Sonata da Chiesa with different moments in the celebration of Mass, for instance. We end, by the time of the post-communion, happy or inspired, and that's the music we get. Along the way, we have different affects for the different moments of the ceremony. And you know, whether it comes from the association of sonata music with the Mass, or whether it comes from, you know, simply a kind of generic sequence of affects that works well in the way that we, you know, parse our meals out with, you know, an antipasto, a prima e secondo, that just seemed right. You know, I can't account for the origins, but this principle of kind of a generic flow of affects is convincing to me for one reason or another. That was probably a longer answer than that needed.
Okay. Thank you, Gregory Barnett. And now I am very pleased to introduce you the second speaker of this session, Alberto Sanna. Alberto Sanna is a musicologist and violinist from Sardinia. And And he studied in Milan, Boston, Oxford, and taught in the Oxford College before moving to Liverpool, where he's a senior lecturer in music and artistic director of musical performance at Hope University. Is currently working on a new book on Arcangelo Corelli, in particular on Corelli and Poetics of Sonata. And today he speaks about between performance and composition, generic norms and poetic choices in the work of Arcangelo Corelli.
A common way of understanding Corelli's historical position within Western art music is as a typical transitional figure, a composer who synthesized his predecessors' achievements, improved upon them when needed, and by clearing the ground for Vivaldi, Bach, and Handel, ultimately brought the so-called Baroque style into full flower. Numerous music historians have endowed Corelli with an extraordinarily receptive nature. They portrayed him as a kind of sponge composer, whose historical mission was to reconcile into a higher, all-encompassing unity the hitherto divergent compositional practices of his countrymen. The emergence of Corellian scholarship as a specialized area of musicological activity in the late 1960s resulted in a revision of these patterns of influence. Corelli experts came to think of the composer as the inheritor and most prominent representative of specific traditions of instrumental music from Bologna and from Rome. What were once identified as mid to late Baroque style features were now viewed as compositional practices characteristic of certain sonata composers of the previous generation, namely Maurizio Cazzati, Giovanni Battista Vitali, Giovanni Maria Bononcini, Lelio Colista, Alessandro Stradella, and Carlo Ambrogio Ornati. This change of perspective did not occur overnight. In the course of the previous 6 Corelli conferences held here in Fusignano, musicologists repeatedly attempted to determine Corelli's style, both on its own terms and in relationship to that of other late 17th century masters. The crux of the historiographical matter was to articulate the relationship between continuities and innovations in Corelli's oeuvre. 2 competing explanatory models emerged, which, for the present purpose, I shall term the historical diachronic model and the analytical synchronic model. In the former model, the historical diachronic, the constituent elements of Corelli's music were separated out to show how the composers blended distinct styles. If Corelli's work represented either the peak of a certain stylistic trend or a transition from one style to another, then the very acts of identifying characteristic, harmonic, melodic, rhythmic, and formal features amounted to accounting for Corelli's individual style. In the latter explanatory model, the analytical synchronic, Corelli's compositions were reduced to a more or less definite number of voice-leading patterns, variously referred to in the specialistic literature as modules of tonal action, building blocks, constructional units, and the like. Key to this mode of historical explanation was Heinrich Schenker's idea of levels of structure, whereby a common harmonic background is postulated beneath the superficial diversity of musical compositions in various genres. Accordingly, the voice-leading patterns of any Corelli piece could be said to form a background level of structure that may or may not have been similar to that of other earlier and later works, whether by Corelli himself or by other composers. I should probably say that I do not share in the conceptual premise underlying both explanatory models. In fact, I find the whole notion of musical influence particularly ambiguous and misleading for the analysis of 17th century musical cultures. In the absence of a concrete historical evidence, it is often used as a sort of tautological hermeneutic tool, which can be coupled with comparative stylistic analysis to corroborate practically any theory of musical historical development. All it takes is to locate in pieces by Corelli and by any one of his contemporaries musical figures which on the surface look identical, and upon this evidence alone to infer profound compositional affinities between the two individuals. And it does not actually matter whether the figures in question are in the foreground or in the background. I could literally cite dozens of examples, but will only show you the opening grave of Corelli's sonatas, Opus 3, number 11, which is the example 1 in your handout. And note that a musicologist of Claude Palisca's caliber called it a French overture in the style of Jean-Baptiste Lully. Because, and I quote, it's upbeat motifs, dotted rhythms, many first inversion chords and suspensions, and close imitations in a prevailing homophonic style, end of quote. Admittedly, the example is a bit extreme, but I think you get my point here. All this said, I do find both explanatory models attractive in their own terms, and I must confess that as a doctoral student, they opened up for me a whole world of interpretative solutions to the dilemmas posed by Corelli's works. In this paper, therefore, I try to offer a negotiation between music history and music analysis by attempting to strike a balance between, on the one hand, the agency and intentionality of the composer Corelli, and on the other hand, the musical traditions, values, and beliefs that made his work possible. To this end, I studied Corelli's compositional strategies against the body of generic norms he shared with musicians active within his socio-cultural environment. For Corelli's artistic endeavors did not take place in a vacuum. To a considerable extent, they were predetermined by the musical institutions and practices flourishing in Rome at the time he arrived there from the northeastern provinces of the Papal State. At the same time, I try not to underestimate Corelli's talent. For the technical procedure associated with the composer may well have had parallels, and this is what anthropologists call the shared chords. But not so the combination in his actual work, what ultimately constitutes his individual message. I argue that Corelli's distinctive poetics of the sonata developed at the intersection between musical performance and musical composition. His professional and educational experiences in Rome, coupled with a lifelong interest in the violin and specific focus on ensemble music for strings, determined his musical mentality and shaped his musical thought. Whilst at times idiosyncratic and not always beautiful in the sense in which some of his colleagues may have intended, the result was nevertheless extraordinary for its effortless integration of expressive gestures peculiar to bow string instruments into widely accepted compositional conventions. Consider, for example, the 21 Alemandas in his Opus 2, 4, and 5. And I apologize because everybody seems to be speaking about Alemandas at this conference. Sorry, I didn't know that. The table lists all of them in succession, noting for each one its position within the sonata, time signature, tempo, number of bars, type of beginning, and main rhythmic motion. Corelli's Alemandas seems to be all in common time, with one exception, and I've highlighted in yellow this main characteristic, in 2 repeated parts, with an average length of 20 bars. All other generic features vary widely, however. The tempo is predominantly allegro, but also presto, largo, and adagio. The dance can begin on either an upbeat or a downbeat. The rhythmic template can be made of quavers, dotted quavers plus semiquavers, or mix all these figures. The Alemanda's position within the multi-movement work also changes with the individual sonata. Finally, the texture can be augmented from a duo to a trio, and even to a settimo in the unlabeled sonatas, Alemandas, in the concerti, Opus 6. In sum, whilst working, Corelli may have kept in the back of his mind a notion of the Alemanda as, say, an allegro in common time, in 2 repeated parts, beginning on an upbeat and proceeding largely in quavers. And yet, the variety of Alemandas he actually composed bears witness to the fact that surface differences in design matter to him more than background formats. As a result, every Corelli Alemanda is a unique specimen of the genre in whose characteristics he partly shares. What this also implies is that when one is willing to engage more with the surface of the compositions, the variety of Corelli structure solutions becomes readily apparent. The second movement of Sonata Opus 2 number 5, for instance, and this is your second example, may well have first originated as a composition for social dancing, but was so deeply reinterpreted in response to contrapuntal desiderata that it ended up blurring those traits of regularity and even restraint required of danceable dances. Although just as simple on the surface as most Corelli Alemandas are, the piece is in fact couched in imitative counterpoint for nearly a third of its overall duration. In addition, it features an inverted subject at the beginning of its second part. Thus, while still a dance genre, the piece shares in some of the generic aspects of the double fugue. The music examples I show now attempt to reconstruct the mental process whereby the dance and the fugue became intertwined. The first example shows the hypothetical versions of the opening strains to the Alemanda's first and second parts. 2 simple, harmonically closed tunes with cadences on the first and sixth scale degrees. Here, I'm sort of imagining the compositional process as it may have taken place in the composer's mind. But obviously, I'm speculating on this. The second example highlights the fugue, or points of imitation, at a time interval of a semi-breve at the beginning of both parts. And this is the real composition as we have it, without the other parts. So the first one is a simpler version of the Alemanda, and the second one is the actual version as Corelli published it. To make room for the imitations, Corelli attached to the first half of a regular 2+2 bar strain a counter-subject comprising the pitch classes B-flat, A, B-flat. Since each successive entrance of the subject required its own counter-subject, the original first half of the 2+2 bar strain turned into a rather irregular 4.5 bar strain. You can look at, in your second examples, bar 1 to 5. If you count bar 1 to 5, that's how the strain becomes irregular. Further expansion ensued from the first violin imitating itself at the lower fifth and at the minim in bars 5 to 7, as well as from a local cadence on the fifth scale degree in bar 6, resulting in a final, not less irregular, 9-bar strain. So clearly this piece becomes quite different from an Alemanda, such as those that we heard last night, for example, at the concert. Things were not always easy, however, even for composers of Corelli's stature. In many works, there is some give and take between different compositional priorities. This may result in pieces which elude easy classification, strange pieces maybe, but which ultimately achieve a degree of expressiveness unknown to the more conventional genres. One famous such a piece is the first Allemanda from Sonata Opus 2, number 3, example 3 in your handout. We're all familiar with this piece, and the story of the piece is well known. In 1685, Corelli had his first set of chamber sonata published. Shortly after the publication, Giovanni Paolo Colonna was scoring the Corelli sonatas for his personal study and found fault with the harmony in bars 3 to 5 of this particular Allemanda. Unable to make sense of it for himself, Colonna requested the priest Don Matteo Zani to ask the composer to explain the passage. Corelli deemed the inquiry anything but legitimate and replied to the allegation in a rather acrimonious tone. Ultimately, no settlement or compromise was reached. For Colonna, the passage featured a series of consecutive fifths. For Corelli, it featured a series of 4/5 suspensions implied by the quaver rest, which stood in place of the ties. And the example shows how both musicians understood the modulation, which is an old term for harmonic progression. By the way, Corelli's figuring is 5. It doesn't write 5, 4/5. It figures as 5. Corelli's defense rested on several propositions. Taken together, they articulated in a concise yet consistent manner his aesthetics of the sonata, the ontology, functions, and goals of the genre, as he, and probably other people in his immediate circle, conceived them. He thought the passage was theoretically impeccable, but sounded better if played with a great deal of articulation. Therefore, although he intended to, and in fact composed a standard 4/5 suspension, he eventually decided to notate in a slightly different form to prevent the bass player from emphasizing in the usual manner the dissonance, the fourth, in the pair of harmonic intervals. This is how he put it in the letter to Zani, and I'm not going to read this, but certainly the key passage is at the very end here, where he says, "But I have done it so because I wanted the note in the bass, short and fading, for it seems to me it sounds better that way." Therefore, what he says here is that his notation here works, as it were, by default. It does not suggest so much a way of playing as he inhibits an existing performance practice, because most people at the time would have played with a crescendo on the dissonance, of course. So he doesn't want that, and clearly in all recordings, if you don't play the C in the bass very short, it sounds like fifth. That's very clear. But if you play it very short and with the right timing, then you hear the dialogue between the first the two sopranos and the bass in a completely different way, which is what I think Corelli was after. More in general, Corelli's explanation betrays a mode of musical thought shaped not so much by constant reference to notation and written down work, as by ingrained performative habits a composition has actually heard. It was a hallmark of a poetics of execution peculiar not only to instrumentalists, but also to chamber singers, for example. In 1695, Giovanni Andrea Angelini Bontempi noticed these differences very clearly when he makes a distinction between singers and contrapuntalists and says singers belong to music just as contrapuntalists do. 6 years earlier, Angelo Berardi had actually encouraged learned composers to try to take advantage of performers' idiosyncrasies. So he makes all this distinction between the variety in the harmonic profession, how different singers are good at different things, and how if you're a good composer, you actually take advantage of these different qualities in the singers rather than composing as if you were simply writing on paper without any notion of sound. So this notion of sound, which is characteristic of instrumentalists, certainly is not only exclusive to that. And there are earlier examples. Monteverdi is a typical example in the polemic against Artusi, and a much earlier example of how the singers can affect the perception of the dissonances in the fifth book of madrigals. So when a composer was writing in a medium with which he had gained familiarity through his own performances, the potential conflict between composition and performance could be easily resolved. Corelli's exceptional feeling for string textures, for example, reached deep into the heart of his own harmonic thinking. The value of the expressive gestures that resulted from these and other compositional procedures can hardly be overestimated, especially in the field of instrumental music. For not only are sonatas aesthetic objects meant to delight, but also to inform. To put it somewhat differently, the expressive gestures from which a sonata ultimately derived its meaning as an object of communication would have been unintelligible without the constraints imposed by the various generic norms. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto Sanna, for this paper, which shows a new approach to the analysis of Corelli music. And there are questions. Lower Lindgren.
When you said that Claude Poliska associated your first example with the French style, perhaps with the French overture, did he indicate that, or did he specify that some of the rhythmic values should be changed in order to make it sound more doubly dotted? And my more important question, more significant question, is whether in the first Allemande you give us, you've thought of all of those dotted notes followed by 16th notes should be changed so that it's more like a jig and it's in triple subdivision.
No,
Is there any recording that does that, for example?
I don't quite get the second question. Are you asking the first Allemande in my example or the second one?
In the second measure,
Yeah.
you have bidim, bidim, bidim.
Yeah.
Is it possible that should be a triple division rather than a quadruple division?
Okay, the Poliska question, I mean, as you're probably aware, this is a blunt example because it comes from a textbook. However, textbooks are very popular, especially among undergraduate students, and so it is crucial that we also get the information right on textbook. Poliska doesn't actually say that there are performance practice implications in their music, but he makes a very powerful statement when he says, of course, that because he refers to Lully's overture to Le Ballet d'Alcidian, 1656. So it's a very specific reference, and I think he takes it's a bit lighthearted, if you want, if you know what I mean. The second piece, I'm not sure that this is the case, but I'm actually not very interested in this sort of this is not really an area that I explore much in my research. I'm not sure this will affect the way. I will certainly affect the sound. I don't think it will affect my understanding of the piece as a piece by a composer who's trying to make a public statement all the time he publishes something, which I think it's the big point of the paper. Corelli, as everybody knows, is very skillful in marketing strategies. It never misses one shot, really. And that's why it becomes, in time, so popular, so famous that it's also exploited by political powers in Rome for their own end. And so, for example, even in Greg's example, I'm not sure whether the music should be played all in triple time or some in triple and duple, but certainly, even if he doesn't indicate it, he's certainly aware of other composers in Modena, for example, playing these tricks for status purpose, which is what they do with the canon. And I think Greg can confirm that, that Bononcini, Vitali, they're trying to increase their social status and enhance their social status, and they do it also by showing on paper what they can do as composers, which ties in with the paper that was given yesterday by Professor Pasquale on the different categories of performance in Bologna. Corelli doesn't need it, but clearly it could be some sort of hidden agenda there too. So I'm not sure really.
Other questions? Gregory Barnett?
Thanks, Alberto. The Alamanda, for me, is hard to get a hold of among the dances because of them, it was acknowledged to have the widest variety of characteristics. So if I get your point, Corelli's use of the Alamanda presumes a kind of model, let's say a danced model, and then he treats it accordingly and imaginatively. Is that what you're saying there?
What I'm saying here is that I agree with you. The Alemanda is a particularly elusive genre because there's no evidence it was ever danced.
Right.
So what that means that if you listen to the balletti Enrico played last night, clearly there's some conflict in the scholarship about that, whether the balletto or the Alemandas are actually the same piece. But clearly they're not. Let us assume now that the Assisi sonatas are really by Corelli, actually by Corelli. So those balletti are different genres. They're very straightforward in terms of phrasing. We always look at harmony, but I suppose for dance music, that's not really what we should look at. The phrasing, it struck me last night that the phrasing is so regular. You have a cadence every 2-4 bars. I mean, there's no, and the Bolognese repertoire is like that, clearly. So interestingly, Corelli never publishes a balletto all his life, but he's really fond of the Alemanda. And uses as, I think, his core movements in the chamber sonatas for a while. Towards the end, towards Opus 4, he shifts to the Corrente as his main genre, which becomes a core movement within the multi-movement sonata. So I think it's a perfect compositional tool for him because it's got this flexibility within the genre. It's not tied into any particular choreography or succession of steps, and therefore he uses it as a composer. I suppose bringing to bear to that is training as a violinist. Now, there's clear evidence that one way violinists were trained, the string players were trained, is by playing balletti, playing dances, and playing solfeggi as well. So different tradition, but certainly playing dances is a typical training for both purposes. So he knows all this, I'm sure he knows all this, but when he's about to publish, he makes sure his Alemandas have something more of a composer, really, than if I can give a stupid example comparison, it's a bit like Chopin in the 19th century, in the early 19th century. It's really one figure in the history of music that thinks the piano all the time, and yet turns his piano thinking into music that is actually much more broad than simple piano music.
Yeah, look, I agree with what you're saying about the Alamanda, and on the basis of agreeing with you, I would say that other composers treat it in the same way, if not as well as Corelli. For instance, you'll love it when you do. Look at Torelli's Opus 2, and just how much he packs into those Alamandas. They are self-consciously intricate. in their design. And I think you've hit on the right reason for why the Allemande receives that treatment. That's all.
I agree with, just to close on that, in fact, when he first started playing last night, I thought the first two pieces were by Torelli. Because Torelli also writes balletti, which is very nice, but also has this kind of interest then in developing that into a more, a genre that is more for listening purpose, really, than all the things.
The Allemande is the only dance really that for which we have no choreography at all.
Exactly.
The Allemande is the only dance for which we have no choreography at all, and therefore it seems to me there was a lot more freedom for the composers. And Joseph Merton, who was one of the founders of the early music movement, he trained Harnoncourt and Leonhardt, etc.
Yeah.
He always said that the Allemande you should think of as heel-toe. That was his version of it, and it seems to me that always, whatever notation it's written in, that sort of feeling comes across. That's my only comment.
Exactly, and I think that's when you look at dance genre, those are the generic features you look at. You don't certainly look at harmonic relations, for example. So it's the general feel that stays of the dance.
The last question, I suppose, Andreas Pfister.
A short comment on your imagination, how Corelli composed his Allemande Opus 2.5. I think it's useful to make imaginations what step a composer took. In this case, I would say the beginning is quite typical for imitation. I don't think anyone would begin an Allemande with 2 long notes and with a 5th leap, except if he wanted to have it imitated. So this is clearly the bass clausula, which begins here the movement.
I get the point. Of course, you think your subject, counter-subject at the same time, otherwise they don't work. This is how counterpoint is about imagining parts that do not exist, otherwise that's no counterpoint. So clearly, I'm not saying that he first tried an Allemande tune on his violin, and then he wrote the counterpoint. It can be also the other way around. The point about the methodology I use is that I don't claim I know exactly what steps. I claim that all the composers with all the talents, different talents, may have come to very different solutions, beginning from the same starting points, which has to do with their education, training, and everything else.
Other comments? No. So we make now a break, and after at 11:15 there will be a concert. Thank you. On time, yes. So the next speaker is Pierre-Alain Breiwep, who studied at the Conservatoire National Supérieur de Musique of Paris, where he won the first prize in 5 categories: harmony, Renaissance polyphony, fugue, musical aesthetic, and orchestration. His orchestral, instrumental, and vocal works are played in Germany, Great Britain, Lithuania, France, and Luxembourg. And he also wins different prizes of composition. He teaches continuo and composition on early music at the Conservatoire Rayamont Départemental de la Val de Chevreuse in France. And the title of his paper today is The Role of the Viola in Concerti Opus 6.
Every composer has his speciality. His expression is realized therein with his originality, sincerity, and self-evidence. He feels himself free because his inspiration is unbound, as thought beyond his control. Consider Marenzio and the 5-part madrigal. Consider Chopin and the piano. Consider Britten and the opera. And how Corelli and the sonata a tre. It seems obvious that this mastery of the sonata a tre is not due simply to technical or historical reasons. It's much more than that. It's like a compositional school of thought that will contaminate the rest of this work. Consider the opera quinta, notably the polyphonic movement in the prima parte, where he utilized double and triple stops to create the illusion of two violins. And of course, of the concerti, where the sonata a tre serves the concertino directly and will be the essence of the concerto grosso, with a significant difference in the ripieno of a fourth voice is assigned to the viola. How will Corelli, he who, since his first publication, has thought, composed, and expressed himself in three voices, how will Corelli write this viola part? Whoever has heard his concerti is struck by its importance and by the care with which it was composed. Its mere presence completely modifies the polyphonic balance of the sonata a tre and brings an irrepressible flavor to the orchestral complement. Far from serving merely as an effective acoustical filler used by certain of these contemporaries, it is an enhancement that affects all the musical parameters, harmony, melody and rhythm, and the sonority of the string ensemble. Before going into further detail about the main aspect of this enhancement and deducing some practical application of it, let us first look at how this fourth part already appeared. Okay. As was common practice in the Seicento, the nomenclatura of the sonata a tre opera prima or opera terza makes a distinction between the violone or assoluto part and that of the organo. While the two bass parts are intimately connected in their composition, there are many moments where they are divided, creating a de facto fourth part. This is because the bass is the genre, this is because the bass in this genre is two-headed. The violin of assoluto belongs to the trio and the organo supports the whole. In this example, the violin or assoluto breaks with the organo for thematic reason, particularly in the bar 5 where it imitates the second violin. Corelli wanted the sonata a tre, but become a sonata quattro, and for this reason is effectively used the violin or assoluto as a fourth contrapuntal voice. The organo still provides support, but with other notes and other figures. The fact that these figures differ from those in the organo further reinforces the independence of the parts. However, there are exceptions which are quite extraordinary. The viola sounds the dissonances, notably by means of suspension, contrary motion, and passing notes. Of the 7 figured names, all but one here are assigned to the viola. The other parts are consonant, which confer on the viola a completely separate role. It's the only part sounding the dissonance. It is not rare for Corelli to assign the viola the superior cadenza by the permutation of the voices. This example is unique. It would have been logical to assign the bass to the viola, but here it is in the second violins, and the viola plays the superior cadenza. At certain cadences that could be termed dissonant, the viola part enhances the ensemble significantly, sometimes by an idiomatic contrapuntal encounter that occurs in contrary motion with the violin. the elegant contrary motion is strongly dissonant, especially when this encounters the violin at the same level. Also, the resulting dissonance bears witness to a concern for sonority. When playing in the harpsichord, you have a problem with the right hand, because we play just without violin. With the violin, the encoder is 2 times. Corelli is fond of upper harmonic pedals with some beautiful dissonances. They are particularly amplified by the viola voice, notably through the use of passing notes. By writing his viola in a third or 10th relation with the bass under an upper pedal, Corelli causes strong dissonances. The most common solution for harmonic fillers become here a most effective means of enhancement. When he orchestrates his pedal as wonderfully as this example, the dissonances was result from a passing note in the viola shape against nearly all the part of the violins, the viola playing it in its high register. When not generating dissonances, the viola part can also enhance the polyphony, thought, melody, and rhythm. The use of imitation is frequent, yet without resulting in a complex contrapuntical setting. In the fugal movement, Corelli hardly ever lets the viola take the subject by itself. On the other hand, he writes many false entries in this example, preserving the rhythmical essence of the subject and not hesitating to adapt it melodically to harmonic dictates. For memory, the subject of this fugue is melodic imitation is the most natural, here with the bass. But we can find also rhythmic imitation, notably to lighten the contrapuntal discourse or invigorate the static harmonic range. Corelli often uses a very common device, writing his viola parts in parallel 10th or 3rd with the bass, but one more time is able to adapt it to different situations without becoming systematic. This example, this same device allows the rhythmic prioritization of the bass line while heightening some its discourse. No, sorry, I recommend. Sorry. In this example, this same device allows the rhythmic prioritization of the bass line while highlighting some of its contours. The melodic rhythmic writing of the viola also play in a major role as regards the phrasing, the shape of the character, certainly a more hidden role of the viola part. The harmonic progression are based on a certain symmetry. In the example, the viola respects this pattern and Corelli succeeds in enriching melodically the progression of a simultaneously beautiful, independent, and effective line. Here, it is the contrary. He doesn't respect the regularity of the progression, but invigorates it by breaking it. It is out of him to understand the egging points and the rhythm of the shape. The viola part and bring out here the shapes and the plateaus of the successive transposition. Its voices increases the vocational weight of the dominant. The disjoint intervals of the viola break up melodically the parallel sixths in the other voices and outline the natural phrasing of this typically Corellian chord progression. At the cadences, the original three voices of the trio are sufficient, and one wonders how Corelli will add a fourth voice. His solution, right apart, which not only has a polyphonic function, but is as readily identifiable as the other part of the trio. The second cadence of this example are emblematic. It is the very model of the viola part in the Corellian cadence. All viola players are familiar with it, because in most cases it is placed well above the violin's creative, lovely dissonance with this. That is particularly perceptible in the adagio when we are in major. One thing is astonishing. Corelli never entrusts the violins with this very characteristic line. It is definitely a melodic, rhythmic element that is specific to the viola part, and it alone. The most striking sonic contribution of the viola part is certainly the nearly constant utilization of this upper register. This enabled a subtle but immediately identifiable change to the orchestral color in the interplay of the polyphonic voice crossings. This is due not only to Corelli's knowledge of the characteristic of the registers, but also his knowledge of the inherent properties of each of the four strings on the instruments. Nor does it shirk from modifying the usual acoustic, instrumental, and polyphonic arrangement, as we can observe in the first chord in the first concerto. It is the chord A in the example. So, from a sonic point, it is the color of the open A string of the viola that dominates the chord. 2. From an instrumental standpoint, the natural order of the string are upset, the string family. From a polyphonic standpoint, the trebles are not trebles. From an acoustic standpoint, Corelli opts for a very delicate organization of the natural harmonic generated by the bass. The chord B, in the example, proposes what would be considered a more logical voicing with regard to compositional rules. From a sonic standpoint alone, the color of this chord would be profoundly different since the violin will play the chord A, and their open A strings doesn't no sound as the same as that of the viola. Whatever breaks with routine by assigning the highest note of a chord to the violas is doing to order to obtain an extraordinary color. The previous example illustrates this distinct feature of the cadences. Corelli makes the violins play in their lower register, G or D strings, where the sonority is full, warm, superposing on them the fragile and tense sonority of the viola played in its upper register on the D or A strings. By regularly playing above and between the violins, this unique color papers the page of the concerti, thanks to the great mobility of the vital parts, of which one of the most beautiful examples is the Adagio of the Fourth Concerto. By virtue of its tessitura, the viola can function as the bass. Here, Corelli orchestrates an harmonic logic of tension and release by assigning the resolution of the sevenths to the violas. The bass only intervenes at the dissonance. This example shows the Corellian conscience to lighten and vary the sonority with the alto part of these harmonic basses through the use of rolling and resonances. There are several cases of doubling to be found between the viola and the other instrument, mostly in the fugal movements. The sound of the instrument mingle, color, and mutually reinforce each other by their respective qualities. The most common doubling is with the cello of the concertino. One of the functions of the viola is to sonically link the violins and the bass. The sonic link provided by the viola is made necessary by the instrumental independence of the part. The viola fills this role perfectly thanks to the mixture of its register. And Corelli's intuition on this subject leads him to develop complex sonic texture of the tip to be found in this example. Sorry, if you just... So, inspiration for keyboard players. With microphone? It seems that the viola parts can offer some clues for resolving occasionally delicate situations. Considering the realization of the basso continuo from a polyphonic standpoint, the viola part could do duty as a good ride and treble that does not double the other parts. In the concerti, Corelli has left us several versions of the same music, composed in 3 and 4 parts. For this reason, it inspired the idea of drawing on the concerti to realize certain passages of the previous opuses. We can see here the gavotta of the 9th concerto with a first version in 3, the alto part. And example, the minuetto of the 10th concerto, we have 4 parts with a dissonance here. In these 2 examples, the viola introduces passing dissonance, yet each time they are not figured in the bass part. Alors, for perfect cadences, it's the example following. Sorry.
In this cadence, the violin parts of the concerto can be used in a right-hand treble to realize the except for the trio. In this way, the violins will never be doubled. So we are. Sorry, just a minute. Okay, and you can play just with the bass, the alto part. Half cadences. In the example, the half cadence formula in the violin, it's okay, sorry, it's okay. In the example, the half cadence formula in the violin allows many errors of counterpoint to be avoided. The musical similarity of these two examples also allow borrowing from the concerto the materials needed to realize the trio. The half cadences is this one, alto part alone, in recession, we found also example for parallel 6, please. Thank you. We have this alto part. No, this before? No, yes, it is. It's good. Thank you very much. We have in the solution for parallel 6, we have also a solution for progression of sevenths. In opera quinta, with the alto part in treble end, and we can use also 10 and third with the bass, and we have here an example of an Allemande in a concerto with a transposition, and we have some other situation where 10 and third with the bass can be used. In the example, please. Okay, we have this gavotta. We know also what is it. On the little bit of folio, with tenths and thirds. In the giga, we see this morning, Tim packet the top, and in this Allemande, with the bass, sorry. Ah. We have also possibility to associate this following example with the other example with upper pedals. Thank you. With this solution. Likewise for these examples falling in the opera quinta. The enhancement of the viola parts that have just been discussed are also found in the realization of Antonio Tonelli. We are here. Here, for example, is what he proposes for this same music. Even it contradicts the original figuring. This solution uses the principle described for this example. Okay. Can you come back, please? Just okay. One more time. Okay. I play Tonelli. Thank you very much. What a wealth of ideas in Corelli's viola parts. This wealth is direct result of an aesthetic that attempts a synthesis between elements that are complementary yet opposing. Parts marked by a double vocal and instrumental identity. The mixture of writing techniques, both of the past and modern. A musical ideas derived as much from this talent as performer, violinist, and conductor, as from his talent as a composer. In crystallizing all these elements into his own style, Corelli demonstrated a great elegance in French, from the Latin elegantia, elegance, who know how to choose. The elegance of the Corellian style is usually described as classical. This perhaps distills the invention, the variety, and the quality of the realization of the choice he was able to make. Certainly, these are tailored to suit proportion, balance, and framework, classical concept, if ever they were. Concept that he mastered and for which he became famous. But it's not the particularity of a composer and of a grand composer, a great composer, to know how to modify proportion, to be able to destabilize and to think out the box. He must create contrast, this vital ingredient of the vigor of the musical art. And it is precisely this confrontation between what is classical and what is not that engenders emotion. Corelli's contrast music assuredly aroused this emotion with innovation and even a certain joy. It is important to take this into consideration, just as must also be considered is its non-functionality, its beauty, and its capacity sometimes to approach the ineffable. All the fruit of a truly creative inspiration characterized by an organically developed intuition, a unique sensitivity for sonority, and an authentic expression. It seemed to me that this viola part is one of the many manifestations of this inspiration. And as a major player in the large string instrument group, allows us to lift a corner of the wheel and glimpse a little of this mystery that is the elegance of Corelli's music. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this deep examination of all characteristics of viola part in the Concerti Grossi. This is the first paper until now focused on Concerti Grossi, and I appreciate very much the aim to also to reconstruct the sonority of Concerto Grossi.
Thank you.
There are a few minutes for some questions. Comments? Gregory Barnett.
To throw your examples into higher relief, I give you bad uses of the viola. This is Lorenzo Penna, his opus 7, Correnti alla Francese, and I think he added the viola to convert the, let's say, Italian 3-part texture into a French 4-part texture, but it seemed to cause him problems because by introducing the viola, he caused a lot of parallels, a lot of parallel fifths. And I was surprised to see this, from someone who authored a treatise on counterpoint, among other things. But I offer it to you as an example, first of all, of the difficulties of inserting a viola into the texture, and of someone who did it badly, as opposed to Corelli, who did it very well, as you've told us. Thank you.
I have a really problem with language. You see it, so I need a translation.
I don't speak French, so perhaps if...
Just, it was a question or a comment?
No, it's a comment.
Okay.
It's a comment.
Okay. Okay. It's just a translation for me, just for me.
Another question?
I absolutely agree on the beauty of the alto parts of Corelli, but I think some of its beauty is especially because he goes back to very old formulas from Renaissance counterpoint, in fact. So what we could see a lot in these cadences is what a Gabrieli or even a Palestrina would have done with the tenor voice. So we find very normal voice leadings in the top voices, and then what does he add? He adds a filling voice where he just doesn't have any other possibility, or he does what Penna does, getting some doublings.
Tout à fait. Exactly. Sorry.
Marc?
Je vais vous poser la question directement en français, ça gagnera du temps.
Thank you very much.
Est-ce que vous avez une idée d'où Corelli tient cette habitude de faire ça, de faire une partie d'alto? Est-ce que c'est quelque chose qui le ramenait de Bologne, où il était habitué à jouer dans l'orchestre avec deux parties d'alto, une partie d'alto de ténor, ou est-ce que c'est quelque chose qu'il tient d'ailleurs? Vous avez une idée d'où ça vient en fait?
Non, je ne sais pas. Je ne sais pas du tout parce que il n'a pas gardé justement l'une des deux parties. Enfin, il a gardé qu'une des deux parties. Donc, et j'ai pas assez connaissance de ce qui faisait, comment étaient les concertos à Bologne. Je ne peux pas répondre.
Merci.
Ah, formidable. Il faut un micro pour. Ouais.
Torelli?
Je vais continuer en français.
Oui,
allez. J'ai une petite idée là-dessus, en regardant dans le répertoire de la musique sacrée bolognaise et de toute façon de l'Italie, disons de la région lombarde du deuxième Seicento italien. Je pense que cette façon d'utiliser la viola vient directement de l'emploi qu'on faisait de la viola tenare dans une série de recueils de musique sacrée de l'époque. Je pense à Colonne, je pense à une série de personnages d'ailleurs que Marc Vanskevic connaît très bien. Je pense que s'il faut rechercher des antécédents à cet usage, c'est dans ce répertoire qu'il faut aller fouiller un petit peu.
D'accord.
Okay, thank you. And we move on to the next speaker. Lindsay Strand-Polyak, who is active as a scholar and violinist, completing a PhD in both musicology and violin performance at Herb Alpert School of Music at UCLA. Her research focuses on intersections between the worlds of performance and scholarship, most recently centered on early modern Italy and Austria in her dissertation, The Virtuoso's Idiom, Spectacularity and the 17th Century Violin Sonata. Lindsay Strimpoliak is currently on the faculty of Colburn School Conservatory of Music and is director of the Early Music Ensemble of the UCLA University. The title of his paper is Originality Lay in Not Having Any, Arcangelo Corelli as Gallant Composer.
In this paper, I propose that in his Opus 5, Corelli uses the language of the gallant as a way of differentiating his performance career of a virtuoso from his published persona as a composer. I argue that Corelli's invocation of conventionality was in fact part of Opus 5's innovations, cloaked in simplicity and situated at the forefront of musical fashion. We need to rethink Corelli's skills in view of the tastes and conceptual frameworks that he, his colleagues, and the countless people who bought his publications may have had. Conventionality in gallant compositional process certainly wasn't viewed as a defect. It was the expectation and distinction of status and class, the newest marker of virtu, and it was the latest, greatest fashion and standard in the production of music making. So in being conventional, Corelli placed himself at the forefront of musical fashion. My stylistic analyses are based in part on Robert Gierdingen's theories laid out in Music in the Gallant Style, in which he argues against the more traditional view of trying to separate Baroque from classical from Rococo in the 18th century. Instead, the aesthetics of the gallant, manifested through the use of stock melodic and harmonic phrases called schemata, created a musical culture of conventionality which resonated across broader aspects of court culture and other arts, particularly in Italy and spreading to all of Europe. The harmonic formulas were acculturated by rote into musical education, not through careful score study, through a process of experimentation and improvisation over training baselines called partimenti. The effect was a naturalized learned mode of behavior based on musical convention and quickly provided a discourse of discernment and taste. Gierdingen writes, quote, "It, gallant, referred broadly to a collection of traits, attitudes, and manners associated with the cultured nobility. If we imagine an ideal gallant man, he would be witty, attentive to the ladies, comfortable at princely court, religious in a modest way, wealthy from ancestral landholdings, charming, brave in battle, and trained as an amateur in music and other arts." A tall order. One way of understanding the emerging aesthetics of the gallant comes out of the previous expressions of virtuosity versus virtu in 17th century court culture. The 17th century concept of virtue was a distinctive, particular expression of masculine excellence. It was also a quality which only belonged to the ennobled elite. Corelli, as a performer playing in performance venues such as Queen Christina's academies, presented himself and his top music as a topic for what Andrew Dell'Antonio calls the discourse about. This discourse about had been a mode of discussing and contextualizing music within a court sphere, particularly in Rome, in order to bring the focus away from the technical and physical virtuosity exhibited by the vocal and instrumental performers, and onto the superior intellect and virtue of the noble conversers. Andrew Dell'Antonio describes it this way, quote, "Through discourse about, the noble conversers continue to claim ownership of the meaning of that music, even if they are not creating the sounds. Their ownership becomes all the more secure because their tools to establish control and prestige are out of the reach of professional class musicians. The performance showcased the violinist. The discussion showcased the audience." Corelli was situated at an interesting position between these two worlds. As a member of a highborn family and an employee of elite courts, such as Cardinal Pamphili, Ottoboni, and Queen Christina, as well as a member of the Bolognese Accademia Filarmonica and the Arcadian Academy in Rome. Yet at the same time working as a violinist, an artisan who labored with his hands, he was excluded from being an active conversing participant in the discourse about, relegating him to being the topic of discussion. The schemata of the gallant provided a framework by which this elite form of conversational display continued on into the 18th century. By 1700, the use of such schemata was becoming an expected part of a well-educated musician's work. More importantly, it was just as expected that a well-educated listener, a true uomo di virtù, or a man or woman of the gallant, would be able to pick out these schemata and follow how they were incorporated into the new composition. Jerdigan writes, quote, 18th century courtly listening habits seem to have favored music that provided opportunities for acts of judging, for the making of distinctions, and for the public exercise of discernment and taste. Corelli's engagement with the galant bridges this previous gap between performer and spectator, providing each class opportunities to participate in the discourse. As one of the most accomplished violinists who had achieved the pinnacle of success and fame by 1700, Corelli needn't have actually had to publish anything at all. In Rome particularly, it seems the impetus by instrumentalists to publish was rare. Colleagues at Queen Christina's and Cardinal Ottoboni's courts, such as Lonati and Colista, never really sought publication, and we are left with only fragmentary manuscript evidence of compositions. Back in Modena, contemporary violinist Giuseppe Colombi kept all of his solo music and manuscript, reserved for the private performance at Este Court. Corelli's publication history and critical reception both speak to a split in the display of the published public persona of virtuoso composers in the late 17th and 18th centuries. Niels Asla writes, quote, in general, music in manuscript was tailored to the tastes and requirements of a particular time and place. Published music, on the contrary, had to be calculated for tastes unknown in many requirements, times, and places, unquote. The virtuoso, on the one hand, was one who combined the act of composition and performance into a single real-time display, the idea that no one else could possibly play these works like the virtuoso himself. If a violinist were to publish his spectacular works, it was a mode of advertising not only for themselves, but even more, it was an expression of the greatness of their patron that he could employ this violinist and pay for the printing of such a specialized niche work. Heinrich Bieber, according to Charles Burney, the best violinist of the 17th century, seems to have subscribed to this approach. When it came to instrumental music, it seems Bieber's identification was that of the extreme violin virtuoso, based on the technical display and use of extended techniques, like scordatura, in his published 1681 sonata collection. Incidentally, it was on this collection that Burney based his opinion. So, if Corelli didn't need to publish to establish a virtuosic record, he was doing something else. Instead, he used the medium of the published record in order to speak not only to fellow virtuosi, but more importantly, to the very upper class that he was only a periphery member of. His sonatas display a profound understanding of the idiom of the violin and the stylistic attributes of the two useful kinds of sonatas, church and chamber, infused with the latest Neapolitan compositional trends. Corelli's understanding of violin pedagogy speaks to the performers by presenting a pure distilled violinistic idiom without the frills, trills, or extravagance for which the instrument had begun to be known. It is here that he displays in print the secrets of sprezzatura, the art of making it look easy and effortless, building in the essence of delight for audiences, but equipped with the in-the-know tricks of the virtuoso's trade for performers. Some critics of Corelli have not been content to deplore the lack of flashiness in the Opus 5 sonatas. They have also pointed to a supposed lack of invention and imagination. We see this in Pinchul's remark, Corelli's originality lay in not having any, and also in Burney and Twining's descriptions of Corelli's adagios as long and dry. So what was revolutionary about Corelli's sonatas was that they were so anti-revolutionary. In this regard, Pinchul might be onto something. He wasn't aiming this collection only at professionals, after all, but the connoisseurs. In a way, Corelli's adaptation of galant tropes and formal schemata developed in the Neapolitan opera scene followed in the tradition of Marini, Castello, and Fontana 80 years before. These previous virtuoso looked to contemporary dramatic and poetic practice and incorporated elements of the stile concitato and la bella maniera into their violin sonatas. Corelli's conventionality speaks to his unique position at being at the center of the newest, most modern styles of the day. He was directing orchestras for large-scale vocal works, as well as intimate chamber cantatas and instrumental sonatas, living and working at the crossroads of this stylistic change at Ottoboni's court, able to translate these schemata from their operatic origins in transforming them into an idiomatic version for the violin. It seemed that Corelli took a strategic, self-conscious gamble to consolidate the trends of the new fashion into one sonata collection, effectively proclaiming his composition style the next best thing. Even his publication date in Dedicati suggests his awareness of the dawning of a new era. The publication date of the 1st of January, 1700, certainly was the start of a new century, and it was dedicated to Sophia Charlotte, Electress of Brandenburg, likely to garner favor with northern courts, with an eye to publication contracts among the fast-growing Amsterdam presses. The gamble abundantly paid off, and the proclamation became reality, as Opus 5 went on to become one of the most reprinted works of the entire 18th century. Throughout Opus 5, Corelli utilizes two of the most common treble-based contrapuntal schemata in all of 18th century music, the Romanesca and the Printer. Variants of these two schemata can be found throughout the 11 sonatas. The Romanesca is descended from its origins as a 16th and later 17th century ground-based progression. However, by the time Corelli is making use of it as a schema in Opus 5, the Romanesca had experienced a second life as a basic partimenti upon which its most rote learning acculturation into galant style took place. It is marked by a combination of the bass descending in a sequential manner, scale degrees 1 to 5, 6 to 3, 4 to 1, or its stepwise variant which starts with a 1 to 7 descent, paired with a treble line starting on scale degree 3 and descending stepwise 3, 2, 1, 7, 6, 5. It was typically used as an opening gesture, and that is how Corelli uses it here. The Romanesca leads directly into its common closing gesture counterpart, the Printer. Every display of wit needed an equally appropriate response, and so the ways in which schema were put together created the sound of convention. In the Printer, which is Jürgen's term for the schema, the bass typically does a motion of 4, 3, 2, 5, 1 to a cadence on the tonic, paired with a treble voice descending roughly stepwise again from 6, 5, 4, 3 on the tonic cadence. We can see these two moves combined in the opening of Corelli's Sonata 6. Additionally, the longer phrase ends by means of a modulating Printer. And you can see this example here. Corelli keeps the listener in mind by allowing his educated audiences to demonstrate their mastery of the galant idiom by inviting them to know what comes next. Jürgen defines the aims of patrons of this music. Quote, "Galant music, then, was music commissioned by galant men and women to entertain themselves as listeners, to educate and amuse themselves as amateur performers, and to bring glory to themselves as patrons of the wittiest, most charming, most sophisticated and fashionable music that money could buy." End quote. The use of schemata wasn't only what performers and audiences noticed. It was the way in which schemata were put together that demonstrated Corelli's new, enlightened form of inventiveness. For this new galant spectator, inventiveness was not revealed in the spectacular, but in the subtle. For the composers, making works worthy of praise required being able to produce exemplars of every schema correct in every detail. The more passive knowledge of patrons could be gleaned from frequent listening to the typical phrases of galant music. The active, operationalized knowledge of composers was carefully taught to them by music masters, maestros. An amateur listener could congratulate himself or herself for experiencing a new work as somehow familiar, while an experienced, educated fellow musician could appreciate the effortlessness with which he subtly combined something like a Romanesca modulating Printer to a Monte-Fonte sequence. Think of it as when you watch the Olympics every 4 years and suddenly we're all ice skating experts. Corelli's use of the Romanesca Printer combination can be found in numerous places throughout Opus 5 and is not limited to slow opening movements, nor relegated to either the church sonatas or court sonatas. Other uses of it include Sonata number 10, movement 2, the Allemande, the theme of the day, and Sonata number 3, movement 5, the Allegro. Corelli's extensive use of the schemata throughout Opus 5 gives the whole collection an indefinable feeling of familiarity, even when a player or listener discovers a new sonata for the first time. And we'll just listen to a few examples so it will just infect your ears for the rest of the day. Okay, here's Sonata 6, the opening of Sonata 6. and Sonata 3. Here we go. Okay, you get the deal. And Sonata 10. And it goes on. You practically can just drop the needle at any one sonata out of 11 out of 12 and find a Romanesque printer. While Corelli did not invent these schemata by any means, the immense popularity of Opus 5 helped to disseminate the Galant style throughout Europe, particularly among instrumentalists. Harmonically, each key area is established, then Corelli uses a series of sequences, typically Galant montes or fonte schemate, to move to not do distantly related keys, and then works back home to the tonic. By utilizing the Galant schemata, Corelli creates a predictable order for each piece. Each movement is logical unto itself, is in its place demonstrating both the pleasure of discovery for players and listeners and the mastery of traditional forms on the part of the composer. Through Corelli's display of his mastery of convention, Corelli the pedagogue in many ways provided the next generation of partimenti for the amateur and non-keyboard playing instrumental musician, a framework to become acculturated to the musical language of schemata. Corelli's conventionality can be seen in larger scale formulas as well. Not to be one that throws out all the associations and trappings of the old era, he still invokes the old order of counterpoint in church sonatas in sonatas 1 through 4, and in dance suite styles in sonatas 7 through 11, in a nod to the old way of how composers used to be judged. In both sets, he streamlines and standardizes the slow-fast multi-movement form first seen 50 years earlier by Casati and Bologna. Additionally, the dance suite was nothing new and had made up a substantial part of Bologna's printing tradition that he musically grew up in. However, the extreme self-enclosed, dependable nature of these affective shifts builds on and further invests in conventionality. The 18th century connoisseur appreciated fireworks, but preferred to know and predict where and when they were to be set off. In some ways, experiencing a sonata from Opus 5 is like tasting the most delicious vanilla bean cake. It's not as if the average person has never had vanilla cake before. On the contrary, vanilla cake is practically a default flavor for cake mixes, and even the word vanilla has come to be associated with being plain, ordinary, and dull. But when he or she has it from his favorite bakery, that is what makes the experience delightful. It's the subtlety of an artisan baker that transforms the ordinary into something both interesting and delicious. The frosting to Corelli's vanilla bean cake of musical conventionality, of course, was the lovely lacy fondant ornamentation that later virtuosi added to the Opus 5 sonatas, maintaining convention while dusting it with sparkly sugar topping, making the presentation of the sonatas into the ephemeral marvel of a present tense performance. Against this backdrop, it makes sense that the sonatas of Opus 5 were very quickly adopted as unfrosted cakes for the next 100 years for virtuosi to decorate with their own special frosting and fondant. I briefly just want to mention the issue of ornamentation and how particularly in vocal music, the use of tasteful ornamentation was considered another integral aspect of the performance of Galant style. It is here that we might glean a better understanding of the publication of Corelli's 1710 ornaments, quote, as he wished them to be played. Even here, ornaments continued to present a model of Galant sentiment, even down to sugary topping, giving Corelli's music buyers the illusion that they were in some way in touch with the maestro. In Opus 5, Corelli lays out his mastery of conventionality, from his foundation on Galant schemata to his distillation of genre, and even in open-ended suggestions for ornamentation. He lays out the most up-to-date stylistic options available to instrumental composers of his generation, as well as providing a well-balanced listening platform for audiences to display their own Galant taste. Corelli was not trying to prove through publication that he was the world's greatest technical virtuoso on violin. He didn't have to because he already had that reputation. What he did prove was that he also possessed the distinction of being able to craft the most idealized, idiolectic kind of violin sonata possible, capable of founding an enduring tradition and a consolidation of trends. He defined his published persona as a well-educated and fashionable musicus and a man of the Galant, making his work appealing to listeners and to virtuosi of all kinds throughout Europe for the next 100 years. Through Corelli's Opus 5, 18th century violinists would refine and define their own performing and composing in the Galant style, inspiring meraviglia in their audiences as they transformed a work that everyone knew into the experience of their own invention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I imagine there were many questions about this image of Corelli as gallant composer. And we have 10 minutes for some questions or remarks. Alberto Sanna, please.
Thank you, Lindsay. I don't doubt for a minute that in 1700, Corelli is thinking about his self-promotion all the time. And so, you could read part of Opus 5 as a promotional tool. And I quite like the theories you use of Gerdingen. But there's one question, which is, don't you think, this notion of galant, which has become current now in musicology, it actually applies to 18th century music, and music especially in places like Paris, London, Vienna, where there's the rise of an audience very different from what 17th century musicians experienced. So the question is, don't you think that Rome in the late 17th century was a very different place from the Paris of the 18th century, or even the Amsterdam or Locatelli? Locatelli is a typical example of a composer that uses and reuses all this formula all the time. So don't you think there's a lack of sense of contextual history there, who the audience are? I personally think that even between Queen Christina, Cardinal Pamphili, and Cardinal Toboni, the differences are huge. And he's not working for the same patron all the time. He's working on a different. So I think this, don't you think that this is a bit too generalized in a sense?
The ideas of discernment and the qualities of judgment and distinction are slightly different from the 17th century into the 18th century, certainly. But it is this shared language of conventionality for which Corelli really solidifies in his instrumental music that provides that gateway into the 18th century. It's one of the reasons that I think his music becomes such a lightning rod for instrumental musicians. Certainly the era in which he is composing he straddles both worlds in some way. His lifelong, he lives most of his life in courts where he is the subject of a discourse about. So he is and this is a term that applies much more specifically to the world of the 17th century. This idea of how does nobility differentiate themselves in the wake of such fabulous talent? How do they establish themselves as superior to someone who is able to extemporize on their instrument with such mastery? And so the way of speaking with distinction is certainly Corelli would have been talked about. And so finding kind of this way of expressing his harmonic and this kind of conventionalized harmonic language into the 18th century provides a way to create a format for judgment and distinction on both sides. So Opus 5 kind of is the nexus at which then stylistic changes come and diverge from one century to the next.
Other remarks?
Yes, your theory could just as well go for Vivaldi, reducing everything to schemata.
Absolutely.
Yes. So do you think, actually this is not proving that it's a poor approach, and by reducing actually, it's a sort of reductionalist approach to music in general. I mean, the fact that we found out the importance of Menti in the training of musicians, and actually the flourishing of this training at a certain moment in music history is not actually a key to understanding what the work of art in itself meant. Do I make myself clear? Because you could say the same about a polyphony or about Palestrina or whatever.
And I'm not trying to say that the essence of Corelli is galant schemata. I'm saying it's another element, and his conventionality is something that becomes a touchstone in some way and provides a format. It's certainly the variety of perspectives here have shown that there are so many different elements of Corelli's music that made it influential and long-lasting. But there is one element that certainly made it influential in a compositional sense, and that provided a different perspective to how he was presenting himself other than just a violinist.
Yes, but that's actually just a flourishing of a style, isn't it? You could say the same about Lully and his style. You could say this about any flourishing of a style. It doesn't explain as such where the real appeal of Corelli lay. Aren't we, by reducing history to this kind of schemata, misunderstanding where the actual charm and power of the whole thing lays? So you make the balance very much in towards making it standardized. I mean, finding a formula of standardization. That's what I understand from your speech or from your lecture. Is that?
Well, he basically creates a standard that everyone else follows. And it's the way in which he does it, which is so spectacular. A standard and a schemata and a formula isn't about, and again, the idea of it wasn't what you said, but how you said it. And it's the way in which Corelli writes convention, which makes it so spectacular and so beautiful in its simplicity.
Okay.
Gregory Barnett.
I'll just speak up because I'm bad. I actually want to push back against the last question because I don't think you could at all apply something like this thinking to Vivaldi. Vivaldi is very much outre, especially in terms of what you're talking about, which is harmonic formulae. Whereas for me, you've given a good explanation of why Corelli is so susceptible to kind of formulaic thinking or formulaic analysis. I don't think you could apply this reductionist principle to every composer. So I believe that actually you've caught something that is distinctive about Corelli. Whether it's galant or not, you know, that'll be the topic for the afternoon. But yeah, I want to push back here against this last questioner.
So you don't believe that Vivaldi I mean, the way Vivaldi is imitated after he became very famous, and
I think,
it's exactly the same pattern.
No, Vivaldi's different.
You're talking
Vivaldi's Mr. Drive. He's Mr. Sequence, even more so.
No, you're talking harmonic formulae, let's say in Corelli. Do you really need the microphone to hear me? You're talking harmonic formulae in Corelli and larger formal organizational principles in Vivaldi. I don't think they're comparable.
Other questions? No? Okay. So thank you all of us, and we can go, we'll move on to the lunch. So thank you very much to all the speakers of this session and all of you. Thank you.